Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read along podcast. The Wheel of Time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
That is your host, Greg, who somehow still knows very little about the Wheel of Time, even though he usually pretends otherwise.
And that is Tylor, our resident expert, who makes sure you know how much he knows about the Wheel of Time.
It's a lot. Join us each week as we continue our journey through Robert Jordan's great fantasy epic, exploring the books, the television show, ill-advised discussions of visual media on a non-visual podcast, and so much more. Although actually not, it's just that.
Yes, all that and actually nothing else as we travel on, and I know what this means now, through the glass columns.
Yeah, he really doesn't know all that much.
No, you don't know that much.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns, your weekly Wheel of Time read-along podcast, in which I, your host, Tylor, know a lot about these books and gets really excited every week, and then Greg tells me the books are boring. I am joined, of course, by Greg, who I don't think actually thinks these books are boring. He just thinks my podcast format makes them feel boring. Greg, how are you feeling 3 weeks into this book?
So bored. It's terrible. No, not at all. I actually had a funny experience this week because, again, our format is so bizarre, but I'm always reading, as I've told listeners before, whatever is on my agenda. And I happened to be reading another fantasy book, and I paused in the middle of one of these chapters because I realized I was confusing my worlds, which felt very silly since we're so well established in Wheel of Time, but I was like, no, that can't happen. I was like, oh no, wait, I'm in the wrong fictional fantasy universe. So let that be a lesson to you, kids. Don't read fantasy, or if you do, don't read two different fantasies intertwined.
Or if you do, make up some really awesome stuff and put it in your Dungeons and Dragons campaign. Getting two books mixed up and going, oh, that's a good idea, is most of how my creativity works. I thought we had two pretty interesting chapters this week. They kind of made me have a lot of questions, which I think is great, but also means that we end the chapter with a whole lot of questions. Was that your takeaway as well?
Yeah, I mean, just to make sure we check off some of our standard cliches, this was pure roller coaster clicking up the start of the hill, right? You know that moment where the roller coaster kind of shoots onto the hill and then you kind of slump back and then it's like, that's the moment we're at, right? It's like we zipped out of the starting and then we're just like settling back and it's like, okay, now we're going to ratchet up. So I would say I left the two chapters thinking like, oh, that was some fun ratcheting. And I'm excited to see where some of those plot lines go, but it didn't make for the most thrilling of reads.
I think that is accurate. This feels like one of those weeks where a lot happened, and so we won't have a ton to say, but also the things that happened weren't earth-shaking, and so it's not quite as satisfying as some of the times when we say a lot happened, and so there's not much to say. Just to make sure everyone is on the right place and is not listening to an episode and then shocked when I start my summary, we are, of course, this week talking about Lord of Chaos, chapters 3 and 4. That is A Woman's Eyes and A Sense of Humor. It's not very often that we get two chapters in a row with the same character in completely different sides of the continent. Minor spoiler, I guess, kind of. Any thoughts on these two chapters overall or the structure of this book just a few weeks in before I start my hopefully not too long summary?
When you started that sentence about how we don't always get chapters where, I thought you were going to say that start with an article in the exact same way, right? So like you said, chapter 3, A Woman's Eyes, chapter 4, A Sense of Humor, chapter 2 was A New Arrival, and chapter 5 is A Different Dance. So we're in the middle of a string of very similar structured titles. I didn't look what's beyond A Different Dance. Nope, it stops there. So, all right, doesn't mean anything. But hey, when you're this deep into a read-along podcast, you take what you can get.
Chapter 3, A Woman's Eyes. Rand's channels creating a gateway, and they step through it into a clearing. Rand ignores Avienda's call to keep to wait for her, and they leave and close the gateway before she can meet up with them. Rand warns Taim to be prepared for the Forsaken coming here, but Taim seems unfazed. Rand lists a number of shadow spawn, including in the list Golem, something that he has never thought of before, and realizes that must be something that he got from Lews Therin. He warns Taim to expect dark friends and shadow spawns in the south due to the ways being tainted, and Taim doesn't seem overwhelmed by all of this, but he does confirm that he doesn't know what balefire is and does seem confused by some of the things that Rand is mentioning. They arrive at a small cluster of buildings, seeing a number of women and children, as well as the 27 men who suspect that they can channel. Rand notes two of the youngest, Eben Hopwill and Fedwin Moore, and also an older man, Damer Flynn. Rand then talks to Taim, asking him to test the men, and Taim is shocked that Rand doesn't know how to test men himself. Taim asks if this is all that Rand intends for him, and Rand stresses how important it is to the world. Lews Therin, in his mind, insists that Rand should not trust Mazrim Taim, but Rand introduces Taim to the group, and when Jer Grady says he is continuing going home and his wife stares at Rand, Rand says that he can go if he wants to, but once he begins to learn, he is bound to him, and he becomes a soldier. Taim then tests one of the men, Damer Flynn, saying that he will start small, and Taim channels a small flame and tells Damer to focus on it. After about 10 minutes, Rand can feel the resonance that he was told to expect, and then 2 minutes later, Rand agrees and says that Damer Flynn can learn. Taim then encourages Damer and Rand to learn testing by watching him, but Rand says that he will leave because he already knows the test, and Lews Therin once again demands that he kills Mazrim Taim. Taim eventually catches up to Rand as he walks out of the village, and Taim seems worried about the costs of Rand seems worried about the cost of men channeling, and he's also watching the wives try to talk many of the men out of joining the group. Rand tells Taim to walk the edge with their training and to push them, and when Taim asks what to teach them, Rand says to teach them to be weapons. Rand compares his goal to the strength of the Aes Sedai, and Taim seems to accept this as a reason to grow as fast as possible. Rand begins listing the enemies he will need to defeat and the goals he will achieve, and among that list, he lists cleansing Saidin, much to Taim's shock. Taim asks if he has any Sa'angriel, and Rand dismisses this, but then Rand warns Taim against any student who learns too quickly, saying that they may be one of the Forsaken in disguise. He then asks Taim to hold as much of the power as he can, and once he does, he seems satisfied, although Lews Therin once again demands that Rand kill him. Rand eventually reaches for the power, wondering why, and thinking it was almost by reflex, and then Rand reminds Taim about fast learners, and he thinks about Asmodean while he does so. The maidens of the spear then think that Rand is spreading himself too thin and tease him for sweating in the warm weather, and we get a reminder that Rand is the first known child of a maiden, and that is why the maidens treat him this way. Rand considers visiting Bashir's troops, but he is worried that Avienda will be waiting for him there, and he doesn't want to risk putting her in danger again like he did at the end of the last book, and so he chooses instead to go to Tyr, but before he does, he locks eyes with Sora Grady, the wife of Jer Grady, who seems distraught as her husband is being tested. This was my favorite of the two chapters. I thought there was a lot of really intriguing stuff here, and we still don't know Taim well enough to really kind of have this be just business as usual. Was that your impression as well, or did this kind of feel like catch-up rather than advancing the plot?
No, I mean, I thought this was like a big revelation, right? Like, we knew Rand was interested in the other men who could channel and kind of would not be persecuting them the way they had been previously. But that, to me, is a big step from, like, I'm starting a school to train them and, you know, seemingly going to raise an army of men who can channel. So that seemed huge, and I was very much interested in that. I think I was less interested in the interplay between Taim and Rand. I kind of got the, like, two roosters strutting around each other vibe from them before. So, like, this didn't really add to that in really anything any substantive way. And then the idea that, some of these will stay, some of them will go, and if any of them are too good, they might be a Forsaken in disguise. I mean, that's all. There's some good intrigue there.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of really interesting kind of breadcrumbs that we now want to be looking out for in future chapters. This is one that kind of tells us what a lot of things that Rand is thinking about are, what are a lot of kind of Rand's long-term plans, what direction are they going, and now I feel like we're going to be much better at identifying, ooh, this is going to be something that's unique to kind of this group, or how could Rand use them, or when is kind of the first instance that these, men who can channel are going to show up. I found it really interesting in your description that you talked about it as two men kind of sizing each other up and strutting around. That is 100% accurate. I don't want to deny that at all. But I think the really fun thing about this chapter is that in a lot of ways it's three men. Lews Therin seems to be very actively involved in this discussion in a way that he hadn't been previously, and I thought the first instance of this where Lews Therin kind of bleeds through and Rand mentions a type of shadow spawn he's never heard of before, a golem, that kind of both was a really meaningful moment because Taim seemed really thrown off by it, and I think that kind of set up a lot of what came later, but it also just shows how thin the walls between Rand and Lews Therin are in a way that even 100, 200 pages ago, I'm not sure he was quite, reaching for words and coming up with someone else's in this way.
Yeah, I definitely felt like across the whole chapter, we were meant to take it that Rand is very unstable. It's interesting to me because, a true crazy person just kind of argues with the voice in their head, but Rand kind of recognizes how he is crazy if he does that. So it's like he's just slightly more in control than again, these are all terrible stereotypes and not about real mental illness. I hope it's clear. But in terms of that kind of character, Eddie Brock and Venom come to mind, right? Because it's that kind of I'm debating a voice that only I can hear dynamic. And so, the fact that he doesn't always, or that he usually recognizes that voice is not him seems notable within that. Now, the stupid thing I want to say, because it reminded me of this, one of my obscure pop culture reference inbound, one of my favorite movies is the movie Stranger Than Fiction, which is Will Ferrell is a character in a book who becomes aware he's a character in a book.
You and Steph need to talk about this movie. That is one of my wife's absolute favorite films.
Oh, it's so underrated, and I dream of being the Dustin Hoffman professor in this movie, noting that Dustin Hoffman, I think, got Me Too'd, so I'm not wishing to be Dustin Hoffman. But there's a funny moment. It's actually not even an important movement in the film, but the literature professor asks Will Ferrell a whole bunch of questions, and Will Ferrell's like, why are you asking me all these stupid things? And Dustin Hoffman explains all the stories he's just figured out Will Ferrell is not in. And the last one he says is, and I have figured out with great certainty that you are not a golem. And when I saw this movie in theaters, there was two girls behind me who just weren't getting anything. And one goes to the other like, what's a golem? And the other one goes back, stupid, it's the guy from Lord of the Rings. And then they carried on watching the movie. So of course, it would seem that Robert Jordan is adapting the mythological monster of the golem, not Gollum from Lord of the Rings, but that is what came immediately to mind with that word.
It is worth noting that the word golem here is being spelled with an H, and thus is potentially as reminiscent of Jewish folklore as it is of kind of like the fantasy literature where you get constructs called golems. But either one of those feel like they could fit very well in in Wheel of Time land. And so I feel like this is kind of a really kind of neat little hint where we have enough kind of real world knowledge of what a golem or a golem is and looks like that we can infer, but we're still kind of in the dark just as much as Rand is, which is fun when he's the one bringing it up. Unless you have anything else to say about Taim and Rand, and it sounds like you don't, I want to talk about the
I have another half hour on Stranger Than Fiction. Just hold on.
I want to talk about the other 27 characters and their families in this chapter, because we get a bunch of names of the men who have arrived at the farm. We get like Eben Hopwill and Dahmer Flynn and just a bunch of, different people who I'm sure in 5 books we'll know exactly who some of them are. But for now, I You said before you were surprised by the leap to Rand is going to start a school and train these people. I was really surprised by any of these men with wives would show up at all. Like, this is either Rand's Tairen pulling on these people, or I'm just surprised by how many of these individuals are willing to say, like, I have a good, stable life, but let's blow it up and go crazy instead. Like, that is the moment that makes me really want to know who these men are and what their story is in a way that we just don't get in this chapter.
This didn't occur to me till this second, but it's the Manhattan Project, right? Like it's Oppenheimer recruiting these men and their families to come live in the desert to do something absolutely crazy. And so, again, that it is always a weird wrinkle that then they exist in a universe with the Manhattan Project, which I always forget. But the idea being, like, what did those men want? Well, they wanted to save the world, right? And is that what these men envision? And like, one could say, yeah, I'll sign up, I'll follow, I'll bring my wife and kids, even though you're sacrificing a lot if you really thought it was the route to save the world or to do something truly great. And I've never been asked to pack up my family and go do something truly great, but I guess maybe I'd consider it. I don't know. Long car rides aren't the four of our forte, so it depends where it is.
I was going to say, I don't even have kids to pack up, and you got to pay me a lot to go outside of Boston city limits for a job. I think there's something really interesting here then about the interplay between Mazrim Taim and Rand, especially as Taim is doing the test for Dahmer Flynn. Because there are a couple of moments in this chapter where I think Robert Jordan is just like putting a big old sign in the ground that reads, no, Mazrim Taim is not going to be Rand's mentor. Like, he is making it clear that Rand is more powerful than him. He's making it clear that Rand is dismissing his advice. He's making it clear that Rand is picking up on things that Taim thinks he is so proud that only he has figured out. Like, this feels like a chapter that wants us to conclude that Taim is not close to Rand's level, because I think Robert Jordan doesn't want Rand bailed out this early after losing all of his mentors in the last book.
And, again, thinking about the way these stories usually work, which is a little Joseph Campbell, but also just, pop culture in general, like, losing your mentor should be the moment you step up. So I thought, retreating into another mentor that quickly would feel wrong in some ways as well. And, I won't spoil the next chapter, but I think these two chapters together show that Rand is stepping up. He is kind of moving out of kind of reacting to things and putting in very strong, very concrete plans. I would say this chapter is more of a long-term piece, whereas the next chapter is more short-term. But just the fact that he's working on both of those at once seems to mean he's taking this seriously.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. And the next thing that I wanted to talk about was Rand planning and then keeping so many people seemingly in the dark about his plans. Because Rand, towards the end of this chapter, he starts to list all of the things that he wants to get done, like defeating the Forsaken and conquering certain areas and uniting people and doing all of these things. And then I think he slips and adds something to the list that no one was supposed to know yet. He mentions cleansing Sidene, which is a big deal, earth-shaking concept that has not even been floated before, and now Rand has it on his checklist, and seemingly not many people know about it, but someone who he doesn't fully trust is getting let in on this plan, at least briefly. What was your thought upon reading that?
And I apologize if I'm mixing this up, but there was a reminder that the ways are polluted and that Sidene is polluted. And again, it all feels like part of, this is to me kind of as best I can tell, it feels part of when the breaking of the world occurred. There were all these precautions put in place to prevent men from gaining that power again. And I don't know that the polluting of the ways is exactly that, but all this darkness takes hold and is powerful. So what does it then mean, that Rand is going to remove those filters and those limits?
Yeah, and I think that's the interesting question, right? When Rand is talking about cleansing Sidene, he's talking about potentially making it so the madness goes away or stops getting worse. But in the meantime, oh, I am worried about Rand, right? The guy who was like, okay, I have these big, giant plans to make everything better, and in the meantime, I am going to trust Mazrim Taim, a man who the insane voice in my head thinks is too evil to be trusted. And what am I going to trust him with? It's training a bunch of men who can channel who might be forsaken and hiding. Like, this is a big risk by Rand. And I think you're absolutely right to say now that his mentors are gone, he's kind of choosing to take this risk on his own, and I'm proud of him for doing it. And I'm terrified of what is going to happen here at the farm under Mazrim Taim's watch. We're about to transition to talking about the Aiel mothering Rand. So this is your opportunity for any final thoughts on the channel.
Just on the farm.
Yeah.
We don't know exactly where this is. It's elsewhere.
Is correct. Yes.
It's hidden place. And, you know, I was thinking Wheel of Time doesn't work. Well, actually, it does have these things, so it's not that. But, like, in Doctor Who, there's often, like, a pocket universe they hide things in. And it felt kind of like that. Like, you know, this is a real physical place on the continent somewhere, but hidden away. And the only way to get there is through the gateways, it would seem.
Yes, although I do think there have been a couple of notes in different places about people coming, maybe not to inspect, but like they talked about soldiers are going into town. So it seems like you can get there from elsewhere. It's just, where is it? I think you're exactly right. This is still kind of a hidden location that no one would know where to go if they were seeking it.
And later he compares the climate in Camelin to the climate outside of Tyr.
Correct.
But doesn't fill the farm gap in there either, I thought, right? Like, it seemed like it wasn't like markedly different, but we don't know. No clues.
I took that to mean that the farm was in Camelin, but that was perhaps a leap by me.
Cool. Well, no, hot. Hot. That's what things are.
Accurate. The Maidens of the Spear sure do like teasing Rand at the end of this chapter. I think we'll have more to say about Aiel humor going forward. But I guess the last moment in this chapter then, if we're not going to talk about the Maidens, and I'm just going to dismiss that concept entirely, I loved the final moment of this chapter. The idea of Rand now kind of realizing that even if he is embracing men at war, he is still harming the women of the world, right? He has so hard fought to keep the maidens out of battle and to keep Aviendha out of danger and to not even kill Lanfear because she is a woman. The lesson that I think Rand needs to learn is it's not possible to avoid hurting people, no matter how hard you try. And this is maybe our first step on that path.
Sounds like the burden of leadership, right?
Yeah.
Although some modern leaders only want to hurt people. But anyway.
Yep. Any last thoughts on A Woman's Eyes before we talk about a sense of humor? Honestly, like 2 of my top 3 things that made me choose my wife.
Well, I'm not going to assume this is correct because you would have brought it up. But I will say that the last moment with the wife shooting daggers, I'm like, if we're looking for a hidden Forsaken, here's a woman here consoling her husband just shooting daggers at Rand. Like, that's not nobody. That's not nothing, right?
Yeah.
And in your summary, I think you made that more about, like, her husband is hurt and she's annoyed. But, you know, that just leapt out to me. I think The Simpsons had an old joke about how you would zoom in on a dog with shifty eyes, and it felt like that kind of moment to me.
I think you hit that on the head. I cannot confirm or deny that theory, but good work. Chapter 4, A Sense of Humor. Rand emerges into a military encampment in Tyr near the border with Ilion. Rand notes that the red armbands on a number of the Thunder Walkers, the Aiel who are with him, designate them as Siswayaman, which he translates as the spears of the dragon, or even more accurately, the spears that belong to the dragon. Rand asks the clan chiefs where Wiraman is, and he is given directions and also told that no clan chiefs have been invited to plan strategy since the last time that Rand was in the area. The Thunder Walkers, who are assigned to Rand's guard today, as well as the Maidens, exchange a number of joking insults, which Rand doesn't seem to get at all, but I actually found pretty amusing. teasing, they all decide that one of the maidens has the best sense of humor. Eventually, Rand enters the Tyr and Kyrienen part of the camp, where a number of people seem to follow Rand's orders, but they still don't believe why they are doing it, particularly his orders about killing ravens and rats. And also, a number of the men are cheering for him, but also seem fearful of him in equal measure. The maidens at this point compliment one of the Thunder Walkers on his humor and ask why Rand never laughs at their jokes. And at this point, Rand tells honestly a not at all funny joke that they don't get because they have good senses of humor. He enters the command tent and has a brief moment with the defenders of the Tyr, or the defenders of the stone, where he reminds them of when they defended the stone against Lanfear and the Darkspawn. And then the lords pointedly ignore the Aiel as they enter before Weiraman addresses Rand by an ancient title and causes Rand to realize he hasn't heard Lews Therin in his head since he yelled at him. At this point, his extended silence clearly worries the Lord, who thinks that he is mad, and Rand says that they are waiting for 2 more lords to arrive, but at this point, everyone seems to go quiet, and eventually they admit that those 2 lords have gone to Hadden Merk in rebellion against Rand, along with 3 others who we know better than the ones we were talking about here. Darlin, Tedosian, and Estanda apparently have all joined the rebellion. The lords here claim that, the lords who have rebelled claim that Rand is a false dragon, and the men here think that he is the dragon, but the emphasis is on think, as they have their doubts. No one volunteers to go after these individuals, as they're worried that they may be considered to be double-crossing if they make their way towards Hadden Merk, and Rand thinks that it may actually be best for him to leave the rebels where they are for the moment, but he knows he must keep up the fear of the nobles in order to keep them behind him, and so Rand declares that all of the rebels will lose their lands and titles, and orders that they surrender or be hung. The lords here seem even more uncomfortable with their peers no longer being considered lords than they are with any of the other punishments. Rand begins discussing strategy with them and thinks that the lords all suspect him of having some nefarious intent or being mad, and at this point the Aiel clan chiefs arrive. Rand studies a map of the Dorian Hills in Ilion, and the Tairens refuse to acknowledge Samael or the Aiel in their plans, seemingly arguing that they can do everything themselves because they are just fighting common Ilianers. The clan chiefs eventually note that they are getting updates every 5 days, and so they are confident in the recency of the map, but the Tairens are only getting their updates every month, but are ignoring Aiel scouts. Rand has apparently tried and failed to bridge the gap between the 2 groups, but it hasn't worked. At this point, Weiraman wants to attack immediately, thinking it will be an easy victory, but Rand insists they hold off until Mat arrives. The Tairen and Kyrienen think that they must not let Ilion reinforce, and also doubt Mat's ability, but eventually they give in to Rand's position. The discussion continues, mostly about logistics, and then eventually they depart. But the Aiel clan chiefs stay with Rand, more or less arguing they deserve equal time to the amount that the lords got without him. Rand then has a discussion with the clan chiefs, and he clearly still does not get Aiel jokes. Eventually, he chooses not to go to Bashir, but instead he gets romantic advice from Samarla and Anila, and he tries to tell them that they are not his mother, but they wonder if that is a joke. They don't understand why they wouldn't mother him. Sulin then joins in on the romantic advice, and all of them are giving him advice about how he can woo Avienda despite her seeming reticence, and eventually Rand returns to Caemlyn long after dark, and he thinks that Avienda is asleep, but then she wishes him a good sleep, which seems to make him inordinately happy, and he falls asleep thinking that he, Bashir, and Mat have cooked up an ideal trap for Samael. So this was the chapter that I thought reminded us of stuff and then ended. I don't have a ton to say here. What was your perception of this chapter?
Yeah, I think in a chapter like this, I just end up going broad. And it seems to me the broad point is Rand is leading a very uneasy coalition that is literally hemorrhaging people. And, you know, any sense that after, conquering the rogue Aiel tribes, that he would kind of be in control and have a smooth path seems to be ended here. So, hey, there's a whole bunch of messy people who all hate each other fighting under the banners of Rand.
So I guess if you are going broad, then to some degree I see my goal in this chapter is to make sure that I give enough specific that when these characters come up later, we're not like, oh yeah, they're one of the guys. We might be like, oh, I vaguely remember the name Estanda. I'm not going to make you vaguely remember the name Estanda. That's not a real one. I actually wanted to start with a division, you were talking about kind of the Kyrian tier Aiel division. There is a division within the Aiel that Rand notes at the beginning of the chapter that I found really fascinating. We've had a couple of mentions before of the red armbands that have started to crop up on a number of the Aiel. A couple of things are of note here. One, we get a better translation of the name of the people wearing the armbands. It is not just the spears of the dragon, it is more accurately the spears that belong to the dragon, which I find to be much more detailed. And then the other note here is that none of the maidens of the spear have taken on this Siswayaman label or armband. It is only the male warriors who seem to be doing this. Now, it's worth noting that we have seen this armband both here among Rand's Aiel, but also it is mentioned in the prologue among the Shido. That being said, I really can't say much else there other than I found it really fascinating that there was a faction within the group that we think of as the most united among all of Rand's factions.
Yes, and then it's weird that turns into like a 90s stand-up routine. It's like women are like this, well men are like this, right? Like those jokes that are happening there are very silly, but I do agree with the larger point. I picked up on that as well, though not in as much detail as you just laid it out, of course. But the idea again that not only why am I repeating what you said? There are factions within the factions within the factions, and it's going to be very difficult to lead.
So I will point out, I think you are exactly right that Aiel humor is basically like 90s Jerry Seinfeld, just like observational humor, but it's substantially better than Rand's humor, which seems to be like Jeff Foxworthy, tell a schmucky story and hope that you get a laugh from it. I have to say, I come down with the Aiel on Aiel humor, and I find it insane that Rand doesn't think it's funny that they're called Thunderwalkers because they can't walk quietly. That's absurd.
It was funny to me, and that was the part where it felt like old Weird Al lyrics, right? Like his fat lyrics or something like that. Yeah. Anyway, it was dorky, but in an endearing way.
This is all we have to talk about in this chapter is Aiel jokes. You can go on as long as you would like. I actually have to say, I find Rand not getting the Aiel is my favorite way for Robert Jordan to give us details about the Aiel that stick with me. I know you've talked before about the Aiel kind of being a culture that is just kind of like going off your back. It's just like, okay, whatever. I hear the facts and they're kind of gone. I find this to be a scene that makes me want to learn more about the Aiel and what makes them so distinct from the rest of, the continent, and in particular, why no one else thinks funny is funny.
And I'll link that into this kind of larger joke going on about the mothering within that. And so your description, like I did feel like the idea of they're all mothering him is what stayed with me more from these chapters, because it is both humor. I just wrote in my promotion dossier last year about how I use humor because it makes things memorable. Essentially, it was a more brilliant pedagogical point, but it is like this basic level of like you're putting a flag on it, you're making me laugh and chuckle at these kind of dynamics, but then I'm also actually internalizing the fact that this is a very different cultural value, and their kind of gag about like, oh, that must be another joke, but it's not, because it's a good thing that we're all mothering him, right? Like that all worked for me a little better.
Yeah, and I think that there's something really effective, in particular of the presentation of Rand's joke, where it's very clearly couched in like the kind of the humor of that joke entirely derives from whether or not you know the social niceties of the two rivers. And so Robert Jordan has done a really effective job of constructing something that shows us the cultures are different through one or two very kind of quick exchanges. I agree with you. I think that works really, really well. The other moment that I found really fascinating in this chapter, in kind of the same way, where we get multiple groups interacting and not quite knowing how to kind of deal with the information they're getting from the other, I found seeing the Kyrienen and the Aiel and the Tairen all in one room and kind of talking past each other in many places was really interesting. In particular, the scene where the Tairens are trying to downplay the rebellion while upplaying their own loyalty, while the people from Kyrien are basically trying to do the opposite to get the Tairens in trouble with Rand. I found kind of watching the nobles tell Rand about the rebellion to actually be way more interesting than the rebellion itself.
Well, and when this side is so messy, it's kind of hard to think of this rebellion as a major threat. And I think that is a risk of where we are with Rand at this point, right? Yeah. That the more kind of all-powerful and mythologically destined he seems to be, a small threat like some nobles going to hide in the woods doesn't seem that big a deal. And I mean, Rand kind of reacts that way. He's like, yeah, do some arrest warrants. Like, you know, it kind of felt like, I think it's Dark Knight where, is it Alfred or is it Morgan Freeman? One of them tells a long story about like when the thieves are hiding in the woods, you just burn the woods down, right? And it felt like Rand is kind of at the level of like, yeah, I don't have time to deal with this. I'm just going to burn them all down, metaphorically or literally.
It took you like 5 seconds to emphasize just how pro-Patriot Act that movie is, which is a bizarre fact about that movie. But no,
it really is.
I think that is exactly spot on right. I do want to note that this rebellion was actually pretty solidly called by Rand a couple of books ago. At the beginning of book 4, when he's in Tyr, Rand is kind of choosing which lords does he trust enough to send to Kyrien, which lords does he need to keep close, and which lords can he kind of leave but not give any real responsibility. Every single one of the rebellious lords is one that Rand had singled out in that kind of heart of the stone call out the lords in the previous book. So some of those situations where we had said like Rand might be making enemies and we're not sure how it's going to play out, this is how it's going to play out. The other kind of note that I had tied up in that is I thought it was really fascinating. Lord Weiraman has specifically been chosen for this task because he is too powerful for Rand not to give him a job, and Rand wants to give him a job he can't screw up. And yet he more or less is failing to do the only thing he's tasked with, which is keep Rand informed, right? It's worth noting Weiraman does not tell Rand about any updates about the troops until the Aiel do, and Weiraman does not tell Rand about the rebellion until a Kyrienen lord does. I think Rand in this chapter a couple of times is like, Weiraman knows better than to test me at this point, and I think he's wrong.
I mean, so my reaction is a little like, what? I have to learn all these guys? Because I am feeling that way about the, you know, I got the big council scene and the rebellion and all that. But it's like, it's hard to distinguish between these. But particularly the point you're making, just to make sure I capture it for myself, I mean, I'm definitely trying to help listeners, is that Weiraman,
I say Weiraman, but who the hell knows?
So we're a monkey, wiry monkey, we're a monkey. No, wiry. I've confused myself. Weiraman is essentially, you think, testing Rand and trying to kind of see just how good Rand is as his commander, even though Rand is directly telling us like he knows better than doing this.
Yes. So I want to remind you of this character who has cropped up twice before, because I think that will really solidify this. So Weiraman was first the character who claimed that he was sending all of the grain to Kyrien and then was caught by Rand as just keeping it in the dock. And then in the last book, in Kyrien, Weiraman was one of the lords who wanted to immediately attack the city, who Rand sent away. And in the Matt chapter, we were like, wait, where did the commander go? This is the guy. So Rand is confident that he is not going to betray him again because Rand thinks I've already caught him twice. What idiot would try to sneak up on or try to trick me again the third time? I don't think that this chapter holds up to that theory by Rand.
Okay, that makes more sense to me. I'm game. Seems like an idiot. Let's do it.
Excellent. Weiraman, idiot. Great thing to have in your banks. I then thought this was one of the first times that I have actually been frustrated by the Aiel clan chiefs, right? I wanted them to show up and take over the meeting and tell the Kyrianen why they were wrong and get in their face and make sure that Rand knew everything they were screwing up. And instead, their role seems to be to arrive, say that they have better scouts, and then insist they hang out with Rand and chat for a while so they get an equal amount of time as the other lords. And I don't know. I kind of expect the clan chiefs to be productive and like really get stuff done in the way we've seen them do in previous books. And their willingness to just say, yeah, whatever, I'll hang out and be ignored by these people until Matt showed up kind of felt out of character for the Aiel. It shows them kind of being more submissive than I feel like they've shown a willingness to be in previous books. They've always kind of pushed back even against Rand as their leader.
I don't know that my head went to submissive, but it certainly went to political, right? Like they are, I guess it's one bad apple, right, spoils the bunch, but it is like they're getting sucked into the kind of, the jockeying and the politics. And even if they were once kind of all about business and taking care of things, now it's like, oh, well, we got to toe the line to make sure our faction gets equal time to that faction and blah, blah, blah. And it's like, it does seem they felt more similar to the other lords than previously in that regard.
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the right idea. It's so far we've kind of been watching how is Rand changing the cultures that he is interacting with. I think this really highlights how much are those cultures kind of shifting in his wake is a really interesting question. I guess then the last thought I have for you before we talk about the Aiel mothering, because that eventually has to happen, but the last kind of thought about this discussion sequence is, do you have any thoughts or hypotheses or ideas about what Matt and Rand and Bashir have cooked up? Because it seems like this plan involves waiting for Matt. It seems to involve massing troops at Ilion. And other than that, the only detail we've got is Bashir seems to think it's important that Rand inspect his troops. So as we're kind of setting this up, it feels like Rand is getting ready to bait and switch something. What do you think this looks like, or what are you preparing for as far as this military operation that currently seems central to the plot?
Well, I assumed Rand inspecting the troops meant they wanted the spies to see him and to focus there so that they could then move their other hand to slit their throats, right? So yeah. I assume that's an army somewhere up towards Camelin, or I don't have the map really well in my head. Yeah. So I assume it's a distraction. Actually, what comes to mind is Patton in the movie. Patton, goes on a tour of like Athens so that the Nazis thought the Allies were preparing to come from that side, and so on. So it feels like it could be something a little akin to that, but less like a prediction and more a hope. I'm going to say I really want to see something brilliant from Matt, because I feel like we're told he's clever more than we see he's clever. So I really want to see his strategy do something really that even me, a dumb book reader, will be like, wow, that's really cool, which I don't think we've quite gotten yet.
Yeah, no, and I think that that's a really interesting thing to be waiting for, is we know Rand's side of this, but Bashir is a complete unknown, and as you say, Matt, we've had a lot of people telling us how great he is, but we haven't really seen it yet. So I think there's a lot of kind of excitement on my end, just what comes next out of this, because 2/3 of that kind of planning group are people who we really haven't seen their brilliance fully yet. So then I guess what I'm left with is, hey, I think these Maidens of the Spear really want Rand and Aviendha to hook up, and they've got some advice, and some of it's good and some of it's bad. And do you think she'd go to prom with him if he asked, I guess is really how I want to throw to you.
I mean, it was cute. I actually, for all my muttering and not quite sure about romantic plots, I liked the couple interplay at the end where it's like, she, knows he's afraid to talk to her, so she just messes with him. I thought
Yeah.
that was like really well done. And yeah, I don't think I can say that is exactly how it happens in my marriage, but there are times when you want to avoid getting into it on some issue, and you can just kind of tease and plunk at it, and
Yeah.
it's really fun. So that kind of last moment worked for me, and it was fun to see them together. I still am having trouble deciding how to read them because it feels like they are having a like complete domestic life now, but it was like one really big climactic hookup, and then they're not, they're trying to not be romantically involved and yet are. So I don't know. I'm having trouble reading the status. It's a pure Facebook. It's complicated, and maybe that should be enough for me.
Yeah, I think that's about right. The way that I would describe this is this feels like Peter Parker and Mary Jane at the end of Spider-Man 2. The good Spider-Man 2. You know which one I'm talking about. The Tobey Maguire one. Where basically the end of the relationship, because if we are in a relationship, someone might find out about it and they might want to kill you over it, right? Essentially, this seems like Rand reacting very strongly to Lanfear going after Aviendha by pushing her out of his life entirely as much as possible. And it's worth noting that is disrupting Rand's ability to inspect the troops in Camelin, and it has never worked in the history of comic books, so I don't know why Rand is expecting it to here.
We'll see, right? And again, as we've ratcheted up across the prologue to here, we know there's a lot of demands on Rand's romantic life. And so, reminding us that Aviendha is in play too seems important.
Absolutely. If the end of this chapter is Samael is in trouble because me and Bashir and Matt are coming for him, it sure seems ominous that Rand puts off going to see Bashir 8 times in these 2 chapters. Any last thoughts before we wrap this up and talk about next week?
No, I would say our conversation, as it often does, has made me a little more positive on these chapters. But I would say I thought the prologue started us off really strong, and then it's felt like a little bit of a lull since then. So I think I want to be jumping around more, and we'll see exactly where we're going next week with our one chapter with a very clear icon on it to tell us what it is. Certainly. Oh, the icons on this chapter were the ravens, right?
Oh, yeah, that's right.
That was a little strange. I don't even know if I know why they were the ravens, so I'll just leave that dangling there. But next time it's the dice, so I think we know what we're getting. So listeners, you should be aware that the stretch of episodes to come are a lot of single chapters because these are long single chapters. So this, I think, is actually longer than this week to read for next week, or at least close. It is, of course, Chapter 5, as I referenced earlier, A Different Dance. I don't know if Tyler kept that or cut that from the episode, but it's a chapter title that starts with A, which is definitely an article and not a pronoun. And we look forward to everybody continuing on and joining us in this adventure. As you are listening to this, you might be thinking, like, wow, why aren't they talking about the fact that The Wheel of Time Season 3 just premiered? And it's because we are in the past. But we hope that you are excited as Season 3 of Wheel of Time premieres on whatever nameless corporation runs a streaming service that pays for Wheel of Time episodes. And rest assured that we will eventually record those episodes, and we've done it the last 2 Augusts to kind of give people tons of time to watch and then listen. So maybe that'll be the plan, or it'll probably be this summer we'll drop some bonus episodes because it's just a little easier for us to do so. But we are excited about the show, but we're more excited about the chapters to come. Tyler, I hope you'll join us next time through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, Amazon, or our wives. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, find us on Instagram or Threads by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being a part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe, leave us a review wherever you are listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time on Through the Glass Columns.